Well, thanks very much for staying and for being here. I'm really very grateful to Paul and to the committee for selecting the paper and allowing me to come. As you'll see, it's not your conventional psychology presentation, but I will tell you a little bit about how I discovered this conference. Was one of my colleagues, Julio Bermudez, he runs a program on sacred space, and I teach at Catholic University, and of course sacred space is always seen through this kind of Catholic light. And so when I encountered in this conference on Jewish thought, I'm like, I have to go, I have to go. So, and I had just got an award for this project on Babi Yar, so I figured, well, somehow I have to tie it in, So that's kind of what got me started. But then, Paul was very gracious, and then he said, but we don't quite see the connection. So it kind of created a challenge for me. And how am I going to, tie in, evolution, Judaism, and what I've been working on? So this is my attempt to do that. So here I will start by I'm going to be sharing 2 memorial landscape projects in Ukraine. Yahrzeit Candles, which is the main one, was for Babi Yar in Kiev. And we also now have a new one since which actually was because we won the project in Babi Yar that we got this other, which is an actual commission. And I call this project Le Dor Vador. And this is a commission for a Jewish cemetery in Sambir. Both of these sites were sites of Nazis' genocide by bullets, which has become something that there's a lot more research in Holocaust studies about the sites and the documentation and so on. These projects bear witness to the tragic murder of innocent Jews and the subsequent desecration under Soviet rule. At stake is dignity to the Jewish people, to the dead, and to the place. These projects are personally very difficult and meaningful to me. As a child of the Cuban Revolution, growing up under communism, I have a lot of empathy for the Ukrainian people and their struggle for freedom and self-determination. Our first Ukrainian project, which I will not present to you here, is called Constellations, honored the victims of Euromaidan and won 2 awards in the design competition. On the other hand, as the grandchild of Holocaust victims, I have a direct personal stake on today's projects. And these are part of what I consider my path to Tikkun Olam, to make the world a better place. The show raises the existential, how do I move this forward? Okay, so this is my team members. Just want to acknowledge them. That's myself, of course, my colleague Jay Gabriel, and Peter Miles, who was one of my students. This was the project that we did. Was my first project getting involved with Ukraine. That was 2 years ago. And then this past year, we did this other project. Okay, now let's see. Where do I go back? Okay, so the show raises the existential questions of life and death, of evil in the world, and in particular on the evolution of grieving and mourning. Ethologists and neurobiologists have studied how elephants grieve and mourn. And we also have recent studies by William Rendu and his team that recently confirmed that Neanderthals had rituals and intentionally buried their dead. Here, I will address marking territory as an evolutionary trait shared by some animals and all humans. Marking territory is well understood as an evolutionary trait. It seeks to control habitat for safety from predators, to optimize food sources, for procreation, and so on. Marking territory sets up boundaries of inside and outside, included and excluded. A few animals also go beyond marking territory to actually transform their habitats. We know that birds create nests, beavers create dams, termites and bees build colonies with complex social organizations. These are all instinctive survival strategies. Here, on the other hand, I'm concerned with the art of marking territory for ritual and religious purposes beyond practical survival. So as humans, the art of marking territory endows place with meaning, and we use it to tell stories. So I've decided to illustrate this by going to Scripture. So most of you know the story of Jacob's ladder. The story is, at his mother's instigation, young Jacob tricks his father Isaac and his twin brother Esau to receive their birthright, and then goes to the desert. Alone, he has a dream, a ladder is reaching to the sky, so on and so forth. He encounters the voice of God. And then what he does is he marked the site with a stone, anointed it, prayed, and renamed the place. Now, traditional exegesis has focused on the symbol of the ladder as a sign of God's presence, confirming monotheism, the one universal God, not the local God of this one place. Now, let's focus on Jacob, the stone, and the art of marking territory. So, I'm looking at this as a design problem. So as a design problem, there is a site, which is where he had the encounter, a brief or a purpose, which is what Baxendale calls a charge, a means, a form, and a meaning. So let me elaborate. The site is in the desert. The brief, which is the charge, is to commemorate the extraordinary event. The means are very primitive. In this case, is the metamorphosis of the stone from a pillow to a pillar. The form thus therefore changes from being horizontal to being vertical, from 2 to 3 dimensions. But what makes it distinctive was not just the fact that he moved the stone, but that he went through a ritual process of anointing the stone and then finally endowing it with meaning through a prayer and giving it a name. So that is this connection that transcends the animal ways of marking territory by actually engaging it with culture. In other words, in Mircea Eliade's terms, Jacob commemorates his theophany, his encounter with God, by creating a hierophany, a physical marker as a manifestation of the sacred. In the Bible, the story also has an emotional tone and a lesson, the virtues of simplicity and humility versus the evil of arrogance, which is the counterpart, which would be the story of the Tower of Babel. So there is the idea of marking territory, but that how one goes about marking territory has some significance as well. Now, to return to Jacob, I'd like to point out that the story itself has a form, that it actually, that this form relates to the longer narrative. And here is just my diagram of the story, which is a very abridged version of the story. But basically, you start with these relationships between the house that tricks, the angels, and the changes of name. So that you start out with the house of Isaac, that's where he starts. Then Jacob leaves after he has the trick, he tricks his brother and his father. And then he encounters the ladder with the first set of encounters with God. Then he has this experience, he marks the place, and then he goes on and goes to meet his uncle, the house of Laban. And then again, there's these conditions where you have this sequence of tricks because Jacob is really a trickster, and this narrative and these encounters, this sort of sequence of angels. Let's see, I can't. Now, this, I'm having trouble. There is also another way of diagramming the story, which is as a circle. And the circle is important because, as you can see, it sort of starts with the angels, the houses all lined up, and the sort of sequence of events with tricks along the way. Now, this sequence, this circle is what Mary Douglas called a ring composition. And in literature, it is technically referred to as a chiastic narrative structure. This is a universal ancient pattern as a mnemonic device from oral traditions, where the circular sort of architecture helped to remember the story. Not surprisingly, after thousands of years, I thought I was really being very clever when I discovered this, and then I found out that, of course, after thousands of years of biblical exegesis, both Jewish and Christian scholars have found that chiastic narrative stories in the circular patterns permeate the Bible, and they are treasured as a recurrence of this formal pattern as part of a sacred sign among very religious people. In this case, I'd like to look at it as a kind of gestalt where the circular pattern completes the narrative, that it has the purpose of actually having a sense of closure. And it also sort of reinforces the sense of that it starts out with a kind of argument between the brothers, their final reconciliation, and eventually to his reconciliation with his father as well. Now, these larger patterns, I'm going to these larger patterns for a reason, because it corresponds to what we in architecture refer to as a partie. And a partie is related to the notion of having a big idea or a chief organizing thought, and that it provides meaning and contributes to aesthetic pleasure. So what I got from this thing is that on one hand you have a survival marking territory is a kind of survival mechanism for, but that there is another kind of marking, the kind of art of marking territory goes in a sense beyond it to actually sort of engage questions of meaning and telling the story, marking an event that has happened on the site. And so that the question of how do you mark an event and how do you go about it really becomes as significant as the event itself. So the questions of judgment involved in that decision. And so this is where I'd like to then sort of put that as a kind of context in which to tell you a little bit about the projects that I was working on. But just to summarize, any design project starts with a series, and this is something important with regards to a discussion about intentions and design and creativity. I mean, the whole creationist argument. Because any kind of design project starts with constraints. You have a site that is a given, the events that you have to address, the brief, which is the challenge that you have to do, and the means, which are usually provided or at least are constraints, and that as a designer, we provide a poetic concept, a formal structure to give it a larger meaning. So let me just get you to Babin Yar. So this is a picture of Babin Yar, and you can see it's a pretty damn desolate place. Babin Yar, this was before the events happened. This is kind of what the site looks like now, which is a forest that has grown around this. Now, the site, Babin Yar, means grandmother's ravine. For centuries, this desolate landscape was a necropolis for multiple ethnic and religious communities. There were different cemeteries for Orthodox and Catholic Christians, for Ashkenazim and Karaite Jews, as well as for Muslims. So there was like this whole series of cemeteries in the vicinity of the ravine. Now, the events are pretty horrendous. Babin Yar is the largest and most notorious site of the genocide by bullets. On September 28th and 29th, 1941, the Nazi army, intoxicated with cruelty, massacred over 34,000 innocent Jewish men, women, and children. By the end, between 100,000 and 200,000 people were executed, including non-Jews. In 1943, as the Russian army advanced, the Nazi army sought to recover their crime. And so essentially what this photograph shows, which is not easy to see, is that they actually used Russian POWs to excavate the site and actually cremate the corpses. And so there's really no bodies there. And beyond that, what they also did is they took the gravestones from the cemetery right next to it, and they created the pyres from which to do the cremation. So that there was like multiple levels of desecration involved in this. Now, you would think that so this happened as the Russian army was advancing. Under Khrushchev, subsequent policy was really not too nice either. Basically, Khrushchev denied that Jewish victims were involved at all, and he protected the Ukrainian Nazi collaborationists. They further promoted further desecration of the site. The site was sliced by roads, targeted for municipal waste facilities, and polluted with toxic waste. In 1954, the Soviets built a large TV station on the remnants of the historic Jewish cemetery to eradicate all Jewish presence. In 2000, the Ukrainian excavated the murder scene to build the metro. So this is not just one horrible event that happened 75 years ago, but it's a continuing process of desecration. Now, art transformed Babin Yar into an international tragic symbol of the Holocaust. And while poetry, music, films, and photography raised international awareness of the Nazi atrocities and kept their memory alive, the landscape itself of Babin Yar was ruthlessly silenced. In response to worldwide outrage, the Soviet regime built this memorial, which wasn't done until 1976. I mean, you can imagine, it was 35 years later, they finally acknowledged something happened here, right? And it was built a memorial, but the memorial is to the Russian victims of Nazi atrocities. So the fact that there were Jews involved was again on total denial. Not until 1991 was a menorah built, which was placed where nothing happened. It is a totally, it doesn't mark anything, right? And instead, you can see the TV station that was built on top of the Jewish cemetery. You can't miss it because it's pretty horrendous. And you can also see that in 1992, they actually built crosses for Ukrainian nationalists. So here's this site which is stands for one of the worst sites of Nazi atrocities, which has been consistently compromised by the refusal to acknowledge the truth. So we were, in the competition, there was an agreement between the Ukrainian central government, the city of Kiev, and the competition sponsors, which is the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter, which is basically a Canadian group. And they really have been the sort of force behind this effort to memorialize it, to celebrate the event, the 75th anniversary this year, and to really keep this issue going. So the brief that we were given was to transform this incoherent and incomprehensible park into a memorial landscape for meditation and respect to the victims that died there, especially to the Jewish memory. And the goal was to start to the commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the first genocide. Now, we were given very difficult constraints. So the first thing is we could only use the landscape, we couldn't use any structures. We couldn't build no memorials could be relocated. We had to keep every memorial where it was. And there could be no explicit religious symbols. Furthermore, to add to this complication, since it was a sacred site, according to halacha constraints, it precluded any archaeological strategy to reveal where the ravine was located. So you really had very little room.
Why was it precluded?
Because since the site had been where people were buried, even though they had been exhumed, and it is essentially consecrated site, so you cannot excavate into the site. That was the rules we were given. I understood that because I did ask my rabbi and a number of friends, and they said, yeah, absolutely, no, you can't excavate. Now, so these were the constraints, and so what we came up with as a concept. Here's the really horrible metro station that was built in 2000 over the location where the actual massacre occurred. And they, in fact, when they brought it up, discovered a lot of stuff. So the way we approached this was to think of a poetic concept of Yahrzeit candles, and it actually was inspired because I was myself lighting Yahrzeit candles for my father, and realized that in a way that was the universal gesture of mourning. And so it, of course, alludes to the Yahrzeit, the Jewish ritual of mourning, and it marks the time to pray and remember our lost loved ones. And this inspired us to tell the story of and honor and remember the innocent Jews killed in Babi Yar. The question is, how do you tell the story given all these constraints? It's not like, it's the opposite of Yad Vashem in a sense, because that was like an open site, and all you can do is project what should go there. This is like the site from hell, and you have to do something meaningful that could, with all these constraints, and somehow allow the site to tell the story. So the way we approach this is how do we tell the story of what happened in Babi Yar? So we approach this as a detective story, where in this case the crimes are well known, but the evidence in the crime scene were purposefully destroyed. And in particular, the topography of the ravine is the most important missing clue needed to convey the location of the mass graves and the magnitude of the terror. The ravine lies concealed, and this is like, how we diagram this idea that the site itself had this kind of history of layers where you have the genocide, then the multiple desecrations, and then the denial that that anything had happened. And as a result, you really don't see the ravine at all. You see a ravine further up, but you don't see the ravine where the events actually happen. And so the way we approach this, and this is a little technical, you might have a little difficulty seeing it, is that the topography of the ravine is the most important missing clue, and the ravine lies concealed. And so how we started out is to actually create a kind of palimpsest that overlays two images, and that's what this is. It's an image of the existing view of the map with a 1943 Nazi aerial photograph that showed where the ravine used to be. And through this palimpsest, we could tell where the lost boundaries of the ravine were located, and also where some remaining fragments of the ravine existed and still could be recuperated, although they are right now kind of hidden. So our goal was to make the site itself into a kind of mnemonic device. And since you cannot literally restore the ravine, we propose remarking the territory by recalling the shape of the ravine and uncovering the ravine fragments through selective clearance of invasive trees and undercover plantings. So this is our drawing of how the whole site would be sort of reconfigured to follow where the ravine was. Do you have a little pointer? I don't know if you can. The red one. Okay. So you can see this is where the Russian cemetery is, and this is where the menorah is. This is in fact where the genocide happened. That's where they made the street, put the metro, so that in fact it's really, there's no way you can recover it. I mean, what you can do is just sort of create a framework that allows you to understand what happened. And so what we proposed was to create this arc. Let me see, I think we can show it in the next. This is a kind of closer view of it, is to create this arc that connects the menorah with the Russian monument. Sort of that's what the diagram is, so that people, as they walk along, could actually experience the sense of continuity of what the site is. Now, the site is very large. I mean, I was having a lot of trouble sort of even coming to terms with this, but, you know, this is like, I don't know, maybe about 10 kilometers. I mean, it's just like really, really large, you know. So to be able to, despite all the desecrations, to actually create a sense of, you know, a sense of an environment that would let you sort of be thoughtful and meditate on what happened and remember, you know, it's very challenging because of the scale and so on. And so the next thing we proposed, and here is just, so I'll just walk you through some of the images. So this is a kind of aerial view of, you know, what the site would like. So you can see that it's like, you know, just really pretty large. Here's another aerial view that shows that really beautiful tower of the which you cannot escape. I mean, it's like everywhere on the site. And then the idea of, you know, this kind of ravine through the forest, the pass through the park, and then, you know, we sort of created these different locations. And the main concept was the idea of transforming the killing fields into a field of Yahrzeit candles. And at night, you would see that it would sort of create a kind of topography through the lights, even though it's not the actual literal topography because we couldn't create that, but at least it would convey the kind of scale. And since you would have like 100,000 candles, it would give you a sense of scale, of the kind of magnitude of the loss. So through a very kind of subtle way, we imagined that we would be able to communicate this. We also, because I have a lot of experience with this kind of projects, we realized that this might be also a good way to do fundraising, because you could have a lot of people, contributing maybe small amounts, but we feel that that's important, because I think that it's important to increase participation and to have people feel a stake in what happened here. Again, this whole issue of remembering across generations, and that this is something that a project like this would do. I'm just showing you, these are just a few images. We later got a chance to build a model. This is our model making team. And this is just to convey what the idea was of the candles. This is what it would look like. This is one of the ravine, the sort of fragments of the ravine that sort of remain. This would be the kind of arc. And the idea is that you would have this landscape of lights running through it. Do I have some time? Okay, so I'll just walk you through. So we really, when you do these design competitions, you're really sort of, you never know. You really sort of do this because you care, and you want to make a public statement, and you want to contribute to the conversation. In this case, we were lucky that we got selected as one of the winners, so we got a chance to go to Kiev and present the project, and some people at the audience were very moved by our presentation and our project, and they asked us to help them with this other project, which is what I will just walk you through very quickly. So we call this From Generation to Generation. This is a project in Zambir. This is an old map of Galicia, and you can see that it was right in the middle of the old Galicianis site. This is what the site looks like right now. It's a sort of abandoned Jewish cemetery, and they have cows going around, and what you might not see are these crosses that have been located there. Let me see if I have other pictures. This is the wall, which is in fact the genocide by bullets. It took me a while to figure this out. It's actually the holes in the wall. The wall all along is where people were basically placed, and then in front of it is where the mass graves, in this case the mass graves actually remain, so there is something to actually acknowledge. The other thing that, again, like in Babin Yar, which this is really new to me, is that the Russians, once again, did their nasty deed. So they had to destroy their Jewish cemetery, right? So they actually, in this case, went around. The Jewish cemetery had remained, even into the 1970s, it was, all the stones were in the right location. They went in with tractors, with old Russian tractors, and they literally just broke through the stones. So the stones right now are like this, they're scattered throughout the site. They are just these broken fragments. So what we proposed, and this is just a plan we were given, there had been disagreement between the various parties, and we're following the claims of their agreement. One of the things that happened is that in 2009, this is not that long ago, there was a Jewish philanthropist who restored the site and had this kind of big floral pattern with a Jewish star, and the next day 3 crosses were placed on the site. So since then, there has been this whole debate about what to do with the crosses. And so this was part of this agreement. What they did was they agreed to basically divide the site in half, and the Jewish cemetery would be the Jewish cemetery, And then they would create this new park that they called a memorial park for all the people who were not Jewish, who supposedly got killed on the site, for which there is no evidence whatsoever. But this was the agreement. So, and they had this little plan. One of the problems with the way the plan was conceived is that essentially this area here, which is where the mass graves are located, gets divided from the Jewish cemetery. So we looked at the site in context, and this is where the cemetery is, and we suggested considering as two entrances, to the north and to the south, this one near the river and this one near the town. This is just a diagram of what that would look like. And then what we came up as a strategy, and this is where the circle comes back in, is that we actually came up with the idea of this perimeter walk that creates a kind of circle, and the circle actually would trace the history of the site. So it starts at the oldest cemetery, and then goes to the next cemetery, and then it goes so it goes from here, the old Jewish burial sound, to the mass graves, and then back to the central area, which is where we proposed the main. And this is what the plan would look like. So you would have this path that sort of meanders through the site, and then this new garden in the center is where we would create this kind of, in a sense, a memorial to the people. This was the common memorial that frames the view to the central area. This is, again, the view of that wall with the bullets. This is the mass grave. As you could see, you would be walking along the mass grave. It is very long, and you can see this. By the way, these arches were not original. They were added in 2009 with that renovation. And then, going back to this idea of the main space, and what we proposed, we were given, again, a constraint that we couldn't place the stones or the fragments of the stones back in the old Jewish cemetery because there was no record as to where they belonged. So what we proposed was actually using the stones with new bases to sort of portray the idea of the old generation being protected and recovered by the new generation of that is sort of holding them up. And so that's what the concept is. And then to solve the problem, we assume that if you walk through the park, you would go past the site, and then you can have the famous crosses next to the little church, so that we can get it out of the Jewish cemetery and still make it sort of in a prominent location for the town. And so to finalize, the way, we're talking about this idea of the circle as a kind of way of, this actually happened by coincidence. I did not realize that I was working with this whole idea of the circle until I came to Jerusalem. I had this idea of the visitors coming to learn about the victims, and in the process learning empathy and compassion, and that this was really part of the inspiration for the projects. And it was only after, thanks to putting the lecture together, that I realized that there was this continuity of this circular theme running through my work, which really was purely circumstantial, because each one was really a response to very distinctive projects. So anyway, that's it.